Hi everyone, and thank you for watching this curriculum clinic video covering grading codes. This is a wonderful tool that allows classes to focus on the skills of a unit very precisely. It can decrease time and marking significantly. It allows teachers to follow up in terms of data they're getting back from formative learning for differentiation. It provides personal written feedback, and it has been shown to improve progress for students in summative assessments. So let's talk about this tool, the characteristics of it, and certain ways that it can be implemented collaboratively with your classes. Let's get started. So we're going to be doing three things in this little video clinic. We're going to be describing the value of post-lesson feedback and the value of grading codes. We're going to identify the characteristics of grading codes, and then we're going to be modeling through a process to take the beginning of a unit and a standard of instruction and make a grading code from it. We're also going to be looking at a few different types of grading codes. Some are quite vast and require a lot of criteria, and some can be much smaller. So let's first talk about the value of post-lesson feedback. And the strange thing about post-lesson feedback is anything that's happening after a unit is over has much less impact than in the moment feedback. As much as we want to be giving valuable feedback in the moment as learning is going on. So in terms of post-lesson or post-unit feedback, less is really more. And for post-lesson feedback to be valuable, it should direct students to where to next. How do they improve upon that skill? And give them an opportunity to be used for feed-forward information. It can be a wonderful tool to then take that initial feedback if it's a post-lesson and then apply that later on. So the research base for the limited value of post-lesson feedback, one of the seminal research papers comes from Butler in 1988, where they had three classes and they were given three different types of post-unit feedback on a summative assessment. One had only comments, one had only a grade, and one had grades plus comments. Now, based on that study, the most effective gains in learning that students used once they got that feedback and then they were assessed on that again came from the comments only, because students actually had to look at where they were strong and where they were weak in order to close that gap. But the really interesting thing out of that research study highlighted that the grades and plus comments class had the same learning gains as the class that only had grades as feedback. So what that shows is when you include comments and grades, typically students are only going to be looking at the grade and not the commentary. So if we really want to use post-lesson feedback to move learning forward, we should focus on only comments. Now, there's a downside to written comments. They are extremely time-consuming, and they can also be an insufficient use of time. If we over-commentate on a student's learning product, the chances of them reading everything and being able to internalize it and being able to act on it is quite low. So written comments have a lot of pitfalls. They can take hours and hours and hours depending on how much commentary we want to put in there. So suggesting improvements to a current piece of work in the moment or very soon after it has completed is also more likely to extend learning. So what that tells us is if we're going to be doing written comments, not only do we have to navigate past the issues of time consumption and possibly inefficient use of time, but students should get that commentary fairly quickly after that learning product has been submitted. So not only do we have to use commentary that is efficient with time, but also has to be given back in a very timely manner for it to impact learning. That is a big task considering all of the other roles that we have. And grading codes are a tool that allows us to overcome some of those obstacles. Now, grading tools was developed by Christopher Curtis. You can check out his blog by searching for him. He is a head of English Language Arts Department at a school in the US. And a lot of this information, by the way, and examples is coming from the text Visible Learning Feedback by John Hattie and Shirley Clark. It's a little bit heavy on the academia side, but it has some wonderful examples for for in the lesson feedback and post-lesson feedback. Has a wonderful research base. If you ever want to borrow the book, just let me know. But grading codes do a few things that allow us to get over some of these obstacles of written feedback. First, it allows us to focus on the skills of a unit so we can really narrow down into what do we want to see exactly from students to show that they have mastered those learning standards or end goals that we've identified. It also significantly decreases time in marking. I've noted maybe a 50% decrease in the time that I'm giving feedback to students because of these codes. It allows for follow-up teaching and differentiation because you can very clearly see where gaps in learning are quickly, and then you can identify modifications to help students who are struggling close those gaps, and still provides personal written feedback, which puts more work on the donor than avoids putting more work on the donor than the recipient. So this allows personal feedback for students, but it's not so much work for us that we can't get it back to them in a timely manner. In fact, it puts more work on the recipient, on the students, because they have to then look at that feedback and then see where their learning product was not meeting some of those grading codes. And based on some studies, grading codes do improve progress in summative assessments when we use them post-lesson feedback. So here's what the process is that's recommended in the text visible learning feedback. Then I'll show you a modeling process that I've used in one of my classes. So what the text says is that teachers first explain to students the skills needed from the assessment. So you would have a standard or end goal that you're looking at, and then you would have it broken down into subcategories on what students would need to do in order to achieve that standard. Now, something that they note is that this could also be made collaboratively, and I'll show you how I did that with one of my high school classes. Exemplars are really valuable in this process as well because it helps students see what that standard may look like in actuality, so they can see here's what that code looks like if I'm doing it well. Teachers refer back to the codes throughout the units and build learning intentions around those basic skills. So once you're able to identify what those learning codes are, that can then be your learning intentions for class. And it's very clear to have success criteria for that because are they actually able to successfully show their learning on that criteria of the grading code. The codes are used as formative feedback throughout the unit to provide specific feedback for students that can come back to them in a timely manner. And then students can use the codes to identify their weaknesses and resubmit. They can also be used as discussion items for individual conferencing. If you're in a more project-based learning unit, this can be a valuable tool for students to talk about their strengths and weaknesses. The codes can also be used with grading tools for summative assessments. So those, as we're giving specific feedback on summative assessments, we can use those grading codes as well to let students know where their weaknesses are. Something that you could also do, especially if this is a long written work or essay, if you want to also highlight examples that show the great work, that they are meeting some criteria of the grading codes, you can take a particular color of a highlighter and highlight particular aspects of a written essay that shows, oh, this is exactly what we're looking for. So if you'd like to not only just highlight their strengths and weaknesses by the code, but also say, here's an example of what you're doing that shows that great work, you can highlight that in particular color. So now we've talked about a process to create grading codes. Let's look at a few examples. Now, the first two are going to be various ELA examples. This first one's from middle school. The second one you're going to see is from high school. Now, this middle school example has many more than 7 criteria. This would be for travel topic writing. I think in the actual example, it had about 15 different rows of criteria. But when you have a really broad end goal that isn't necessarily tied to one particular standard, and it's more tied to something thematic or a big idea, like you might see in this particular example or the next one, you're going to have a lot of different grading codes that will be in there. And you could see that from this example. You can also see this particular reading example that was used in high school. Again, this isn't targeted toward specific standards or end goals. This is more big idea and thematic. And so there's going to be a lot of different criteria. Again, in this one, it had about 14 or 15 different criteria originally, but I wanted to show you some examples of what that criteria may look like. Now notice on the first example, the codes were given numbers. And in the second example, they were given letters. You can even go beyond numbers and letters. You can use symbols. But what the idea is when students present their learning product, you mark that code. Let's say on this first one, I say, okay, they didn't do 1 and 4. I would just write 1 and 4. For their second one, when they gave me the learning product, I may say, okay, the only code I'm not seeing to where we need to be is G. So I just write G. So instead of giving specific written feedback that I hope they'll take in and internalize and use in a future resubmission, I can highlight that code. They then go to the code and find where that example is. So we're putting the work on the recipient in this case. Here's an example for a math class, and this would be for a unit on fractions. Notice that we don't have letters or numbers for our codes here. We actually have various symbols. And so what this does is take the important steps of working with fractions, I think in an upper elementary situation, and highlights here's how you do these procedures and skills. So this can be really valuable. In fact, let's say you're getting a series of formative learning products back from students, and you put these codes down on them and you say, okay, 3 stars and a $sign, and you hand that back. Then you put the actual code up on the screen if it hasn't been introduced yet. And then you could say, all right, find where those mistakes are. So that way they have to say, okay, I not only know where I'm not only being told where my gaps are, but now I actually have to find it in my examples. I have to go through all my examples, figure out which are the ones where I'm not displaying that skill. Then when I find it, I have to fix it. That's an immense amount of learning that can go on by using these codes. And it moves everyone forward. That everyone, unless they're doing great on all the codes, in which case you would want to do some enrichment with students, this can move everyone forward and give specific and timely feedback for all students. So I want to talk about an example that I recently did in my US history class. We started looking at a unit that was structured around the thinking skill of evaluation. And this was a grading code that my students actually came up with. I'm going to show you the process that we used to create this, but this wording was not mine. In fact, my students did this. And so it was really great and collaborative because they were able to articulate, here's what we need to do to evaluate a historical source. And then I could just put those codes on and they don't have to think, oh, well, this is just what Mr. Muller said we do to evaluate. No, this is what you said. I'm just highlighting how that's being reflected in your learning product. And then we use numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 on this. So let's go through a process that I did to get my students to make that grading code. This took about 2 days altogether. And then as the unit went on, we used this grading code for students to practice this later on. So this was my KUD for our third unit in US history. And we were looking at 3 standards in this unit. If you notice, the 2 arrow standards here are both evaluation standards. So this is a new type of thinking that students haven't been introduced to in my year yet. And so I needed to show them a process on how to do that thinking, so that way they could apply it specifically to the context in those standards. But also I know in later units that we're going back to that evaluation skill. So I need to create a process so students can show that level of thinking, and it can help them in future units and hopefully other classes as well. So this evaluation grading code is going to be tied to both of these arrow standards here. So the first thing I did in class, this is the first day of the unit, is say, okay, here are the skills that I'm teaching you, and everything we're doing over the course of that unit is leading up to these skills. Then what I did is I handed them a document, and this was something that I had made years prior on how to evaluate. And this is something I gave them, and I said, okay, here's how you evaluate. You do 3 things. You say, you judge, and you defend. And I had those descriptors there. That was on a piece of paper. And in years past, I said, okay, this is how you do it. and then we'll practice it, and then you go. But this was not, even though it was good, there was something better. So what I initially did is still gave this to them and said, all right, here's how I as a teacher think you can go through that process to evaluate, but this isn't perfect. So let's take this a step further and collaborate to make a more detailed list that we can follow and make some codes for how to evaluate. So after we went through and I said, okay, here are the end learning goals for this unit, and here's a process you can use to do that thinking skill of evaluation, I then did some modeling. So what we did is take a look at some historical documents from the content area in the previous unit because they hadn't been introduced to the content of this new unit. And I said, okay, we're going to take this existing process and I'm going to model this out loud. We're going to look at some historical documents and I'm going to practice say, judge, and defend out loud and take notes on everything that I'm doing, take notes on what I'm reading, what I'm thinking, my thought process, and what does an evaluation response actually look like. And if you want to know the actual sources we were looking at, they're down here. Our last unit previous to this one was looking at the American Revolution. And so I was using historical sources where students would already have the surface level knowledge of the ideas, people, and events. So that way I didn't have to introduce, oh, here's where all these new names and terms, events, and contexts mean. We could take things that students already have a baseline knowledge of and then use it for this new particular skill. So we modeled that process with them. It took me maybe about 15, 20 minutes to sit there and say, okay, here's how we demonstrate that thinking skill. And they wrote it all down. Then what they did is we used a second historical document. Again, going back to the example, I did this modeling with document A. And then in small groups, they tried this with document B. So what they did was they found a way to do this skill. And then they were able to practice that modeling in smaller groups, see what's working, what's not working, and actually start to practice that thinking skill. That took between the first day when I modeled it, introduced the end goals, and then practice it, a day, maybe if you take more time to introduce that unit as a whole, might take a day and a half. Then what we did on the second day is we looked at two other sources and we said, okay, so what I'd like you to do is use some of your previously identified skills. That's what read was and analyze was. Those were things that students were already taught in terms of thinking skills in prior units. Say, okay, now I want you to answer this evaluation question. I modeled this process for you. We tried this in small groups. We're still working through it. Let's see if we can now do it individually. And so what students do is they watch and take notes as I evaluate a source again. Then they would use those notes to evaluate source E in small groups and answer the evaluation question. Then based on that extra round of practice. So we had previously done some modeling, then they were starting to work on that and use that. Then they made a criterion list of how to evaluate. So it's through this process that students were eventually able to make a rough criteria list of how to evaluate. Now, again, this whole process took about a day, maybe a day and a half again to go through this, but at the end, students were able to share their individual criterion lists with their small groups. So we came back together as a whole group, and students were able to note criterion lists for each part of my initial description for evaluation. So here's what I originally gave them in terms of evaluation, say, judge, and defend. And then they were able to, as a whole group, students were sharing what they had, their thought process, and then I had a recorder note this in a Google document. They made these criteria lists. So this is all based off of students. So after they made that criteria list, I asked them to send it to me. And then I made this Google document. So I have my original component and description. Then I added in their criterion list. And just to help them out a little bit more, on that second page, I took the modeling example that I did the previous day, and I put it down here so they could see those elements in action in a very small way. If you're wondering what yellow and green meant, the yellow is judge and the green is defend. I also put for this particular third unit the 2 learning standards that we're working on in terms of the analytic rubric. So what that process did, we did some modeling, small group work, modeling again, small group work again, making that criteria list as we're getting used to this process. And then after that, after we had made that criteria list, the next cycle that we were working through in our lesson is we were looking at different slave narratives. So, okay, let's take this criteria list and let's make sure that it's actually useful. So we went through this particular activity where students used the criteria list, the grading codes, in order to demonstrate evaluation. And then what I did was I used the grading codes of what they did, that scale 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I noted it down there. And if I was finding any gaps, if students were finding any gaps, we would debrief and then clean things up. But thankfully, that didn't need to happen. So at the end of this, it took maybe 3 days in terms of the modeling and working in small groups and debriefing together and making this. But at the end, we have this wonderful guiding tool that can provide specific feedback to students that breaks down the essential criteria of a particular thinking skill, which was hitting 2 standards in my unit, and it creates a more collaborative learning experience with my students. So, my suggestion, after watching this video, try making a grading code for a standard or an end goal of one of your classes. If you'd like to see more examples, if you have any questions for me, please reach out and let me know. I'd be happy to partner with you to help you meet whatever needs you have to meet the needs of your students. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.